This month, we're focusing on our genealogy library, the Indiana Room, and resources like Ancestry.com and newspapers.com. The following story was found and investigated more deeply using these materials from the Rushville Public Library. This is the story of Edna Kolb.
And some other characters who we don't like.
But mainly, this is the story of Edna. Edna was a mover and shaker here in Rushville, Indiana.
A star in the Rushville Society pages, a player on the state level. Not often heard of in our little burg, but well-known and well-loved.
Unfortunately, Edna died on October 27, 1929. Not only was it an untimely death, she died of strychnine poisoning. And on the morning of her death, she was at her mother's house, making plans for the future.
This is foreshadowing.
She began to feel the effects of the poison on that Sunday afternoon and died later that day. She and her mother were very close. Again, adding to the sadness of the story, dying in her mother's home. After she died, the questions began. Was this a suicide? The doctor who attended knew it was strychnine from previous experience with the poison, but the coroner struggled with the cause of death. Was it homicide, suicide, or an accident?
Seems crazy in this day and age to have accidental poisoning, but it still happens. But today we have better labels, we have internet information, and poison control. But when we think of poisoning, it is human nature to think intention, and that this was done on purpose, and this gave the coroner pause.
Well, even more questions arose when the insurance adjuster came along.
Into the story, we introduce George, Edna's husband, the main character we don't like. See, this is the second time George received a visit from an insurance adjuster for the death of a spouse. George's second wife, Maggie, died a year earlier in 1928.
Well, we don't have very strong feelings for Maggie at this time, but we're going to be on her side soon enough.
So with the death of Edna, suspicion begins to circulate around his second wife, Maggie. So much so that an investigation began, delving deeper into what happened and what was the cause of death for Maggie.
See, authorities decided to exhume Maggie's body to see if she actually died of the heart attack a different doctor had ruled as the cause of death 16 months earlier. Her organs were tested for strychnine and came back positive. Maggie had also died of strychnine poisoning, just like Edna. When George found out Maggie was going to be exhumed, he tried to kill himself, like you do as an innocent husband. And how did he try to kill himself?
Strychnine, of course.
As he was convulsing of strychnine poisoning, he told his friends, "I would rather be dead than accused."
So a grand jury decided to indict George on the murder and the death of his third wife, Edna. However, finding jurors in the local community was taking too long, and the case got moved to nearby Greenfield, Indiana. Eventually, a pool of jurors, all men, were chosen.
The trial began, and Edna's mother was the first to take the stand. She told the jury that a dying Edna had said that that morning, she had taken some cold medicine, an aspirin, and a quinine tablet that George had given her.
Why quinine? What is quinine? If only I had a library to research such things.
Later in the trial, a chemist testified there was no quinine in Edna's system.
The state also revealed that on the day of Maggie's death, George's second wife, she called a doctor to make a house call because she felt that bad. She told the doctor that she had taken an aspirin given to her by none other than George. So George had given her this aspirin straight from his pocket, saying, quote, "It's just as good as those from the box."
During the trial, the attending doctor at the hospital on the day of George's suicide attempt testified that when he asked George how he had taken this strychnine, George replied that he had taken only 2 tablets while Edna had only taken 1.
The state said the motive for Edna's death was the life insurance payout. It was revealed that George's farm had been heavily mortgaged for years. He owed not only the mortgage, but a $700 car loan and a $600 note as the administrator of Maggie's estate. In today's money, that would be over $23,000.
Then it came time for the defense, and victim shaming was the plan. Edna was painted to be a depressed, distraught woman. Their portrait of her was of a woman who was heartbroken over her youngest son's death because just weeks prior her son had died in a car accident. Well, of course, who wouldn't be upset over this? But remember, earlier we said that Edna was making plans for the future. That's what her mom had said. Plans that seemed real to Edna and not for show. And as things go,
Maggie's name also got dragged in the mud by the defense. Maggie was said to have temper tantrums and suffered from frequent nervous spells. The defense tried to show that she was impossible to live with, and while many people knew about the hostile and sometimes violent relationship between her and George's sons from his first marriage, it was because Maggie was so difficult to live with. Witnesses testified that George was overheard saying before Maggie's death that he'd have to choose between his sons and Maggie.
Later in the trial, George took the stand in his own defense. He denied giving Maggie anything on the day of her death, that his children and Maggie got along just fine, and Edna had been feeling well the morning of her death. He broke down weeping when he talked about his love for Edna. Eventually, Edna's death would come down to one thing: her breakfast.
And why is it so important that we know the amount of food Edna ate the morning of her death?
Because the amount of food in her stomach would determine how quickly the strychnine would take effect. If she had had a large breakfast, the strychnine could have been ingested before she even left to go to her mother's home that morning. A smaller breakfast would mean that the poison was introduced while she was here in Rushville at her mom's house.
At the grand jury hearing in March, George's son said that morning's breakfast was a big one. So it was oatmeal, potatoes, rice, coffee, cereal, toast, all of that. But then at the trial itself, it was said that Edna only had a bowl of cereal and a cup of coffee. So George's sons committed perjury in the name of their dad. During closing arguments, the state called for George to receive the death penalty. They told the jury that if George did not receive the death penalty, that they would, quote, tear down everything accomplished for law and order and the protection of womanhood for the past 100 years in Rush County, end quote.
Well, the jury found him guilty of manslaughter with a jail time of just 2 to 21 years.
It was 1930, and justice had failed Edna.
George was charged with manslaughter in the death of his wife, Edna Kolb, not murder, not the death penalty. 1 year later, charges in George's role in the death of his second wife, Maggie, were dismissed while he was in prison because, quote, the defendant had been convicted upon a grand jury indictment charging the same offense of his third wife.
A 2-for-1 deal, if you will. 8 years into the prison term, George was released, a free man.
Yeah, George ended up living the rest of his days as a free man in good health, unlike his 2 wives. And that's the end of today's story. Edna and Maggie. There's a quote that says a person dies 3 times. Once when their body expires, the second when they are lowered into their grave, and finally the last time someone says their name. We hope Edna Dangler and Maggie Larimore get to live again in this small way as we shine a light on who they were and how justice failed them so spectacularly.
Thank you for watching. Join us next month when we showcase another area of the library.